This presentation details a real-life case involving death and unresolved questions. Viewer discretion is advised. Two men lay dead on a remote Brazilian hilltop. They were dressed in immaculate suits, their bodies perfectly arranged side by side on a bed of leaves. Over their eyes they wore something utterly bizarre: crude hand-cut masks made of solid lead. Next to them an empty water bottle, two small towels, and a notebook. Inside that notebook was a cryptic, almost otherworldly message: 1630 B at the specified location. 1830 ingest capsules. After the effect, protect metals, wait for the mask signal. When police arrived on Vintém Hill in August of 1966, they assumed it was a simple murder, a robbery gone wrong. But the men's wallets were full of cash. Their expensive watches were still on their wrists. There were no signs of a struggle, no bullet wounds, no stab marks. Nothing to suggest violence. The coroner's report would only deepen the mystery, because when he searched for a cause of death, he found nothing. No poison, no trauma, no discernible reason for two healthy men to simply lie down and die. So what killed them? What were the capsules they were instructed to ingest? And what was the mask signal they were waiting for? Dressed for a funeral on a lonely hill, their eyes shielded by lead. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a riddle, written in a language no one on Earth seemed to understand. To even begin to unravel this, we have to go back 72 hours, to a city over 100 miles away. The two men were Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana. They weren't spies or criminals. They were respected electronic technicians from the small town of Campos dos Goitacazes. They were husbands, fathers, and by all accounts completely normal. They ran a small TV and radio repair shop together. They were known for their skill, their professionalism, and their quiet, unassuming lives. But these two ordinary men harbored an extraordinary secret. They were part of a fringe group of scientific spiritualists. They weren't just fixing electronics, they were trying to build devices to communicate with other dimensions, with spirits, maybe even with extraterrestrials. They believed they were on the verge of a breakthrough, a discovery that would change humanity forever. And this belief would lead them on a final fatal journey. On the morning of August 17, 1966, Manuel and Miguel told their families they were going to Sao Paulo. It was a business trip, they said. They needed to buy a car and some new electronic components for the shop. They packed a small suitcase and nearly $2,000 in cash, a small fortune at the time. They promised to be back in a couple of days. Their families had no reason to doubt them, but they weren't going to Sao Paulo. They boarded a bus heading in the opposite direction towards Niterói, a city just across the bay from Rio de Janeiro. They arrived at 2:30 in the afternoon, stepping off the bus into a steady, drizzling rain. Their first stop was a local shop where they purchased two waterproof raincoats, the same coats they would later be found dead in. Their next stop was a small bar. They bought a bottle of magnesium-rich mineral water. The waiter who served them would later become a key witness. He remembered them clearly. He said one of the men, Miguel, seemed incredibly agitated. He kept checking his watch over and over, as if counting down to a critical appointment. The waiter asked if everything was all right. Miguel just looked up, his eyes wide with a strange mix of fear and excitement, and said they had to go. It was the last time anyone would see them alive. From that bar they walked. They began the long, arduous climb up Vintém Hill, a place known locally for its dense vegetation and its reputation as a hotspot for UFO sightings and strange, unexplained phenomena. It was a place people avoided, especially after dark. But for Manuel and Miguel, it was their destination. It was the specified location from their note. What happened on that hilltop between the moment they left the bar and the moment their bodies were discovered remains the dark heart of this mystery. It wasn't until 3 days later, on August 20th, that a local teenager named Jorge da Costa Alves was flying a kite near the base of the hill. A gust of wind carried it up into the dense brush. Chasing after it, he stumbled into a small, secluded clearing. And there they were. First he thought they were sleeping. Two men in suits, lying peacefully as if taking a nap. But the strange masks, the unnatural stillness, the foul odor beginning to rise in the humid air. He knew something was terribly wrong. He ran terrified to get the police. When the authorities arrived, the scene baffled even the most seasoned officers. Everything was neat, orderly. The men's raincoats were buttoned, their suits pristine despite the recent rain. The small patch of ground they lay on had been carefully cleared of weeds and debris, as if they were preparing a sacred space. The lead masks themselves were a puzzle. They weren't professional. They looked like they'd been crudely cut from a sheet of metal in a home workshop. They had no straps to hold them in place. It seemed they had simply been placed over the men's eyes after they were already lying down. And then there was the notebook. It wasn't a suicide note. It was a list of electronic components, complex schematic diagrams for radio circuits, and that one chilling page of instructions. Ingest capsules after the effect, protect metals, wait for the mask signal. The phrase protect metals was especially strange. Were they worried about radiation? Was that the purpose of the lead masks? A crude attempt at radiation shielding? But shielding from what? The investigation began with a catastrophic mistake. Overwhelmed by the press and a growing crowd of curious onlookers, and not yet realizing the sheer strangeness of the case, the police moved the bodies to the morgue almost immediately. They didn't secure the scene. They didn't wait for the forensic team. In the intense Brazilian heat, the bodies had already begun to decompose significantly. By the time they reached the coroner, it was too late. The men's internal organs were too degraded for reliable toxicological analysis. If they had ingested some fast-acting exotic poison, the capsules from their note, any trace of it was now lost forever. The single most important piece of evidence had been destroyed by incompetence before the investigation had even truly begun. The police were left with a ghost of a case. 2 dead men with no cause of death, a pile of bizarre artifacts that raised more questions than answers, and a cryptic note that sounded more like science fiction than a suicide pact. Investigators were staring at a total blank. They had no suspects, no motive, and no murder weapon. They didn't even know for sure if a crime had been committed at all. Was it a double suicide, a ritual gone horribly wrong? Were they murdered by a third party, someone who staged the scene to look like something else? Or had Manuel and Miguel truly made contact with something on that hill, something that took their lives in a way our science couldn't explain? The search for answers would lead investigators down a rabbit hole of secret societies, UFO cults, and esoteric experiments, revealing that the 2 technicians were living a double life, one that their families knew nothing about. They were on a quest for a truth they believed was hidden from the rest of the world. And on Vintém Hill, it appears they finally found it. To the police, Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira de Cruz were just 2 ordinary family men. Respected electronics technicians from Campos dos Goitacazes, a town several hours away. They had wives, they had children, they ran a successful repair shop. By all accounts, they were stable, reliable, and completely normal. Their families reported them as such. They said the 2 men had left on the morning of August 17th, telling them they were heading to Sao Paulo, a major city, to buy a used car and some electronic components for their business. They had a significant amount of cash on them, about 3 million Brazilian cruzeiros, which was roughly $2,000 at the time. A substantial sum, but not an unreasonable one for their stated purpose. But as investigators dug deeper, interviewing friends and colleagues, a second, stranger picture began to emerge. A picture of 2 men obsessed with a world that existed just beyond the veil of our own. They weren't just electronics technicians. They were paranormal investigators. Or, as they and their small, secretive circle of friends called themselves, scientific spiritualists. This wasn't some casual hobby. It was a consuming passion. They believed that science and spirituality were 2 sides of the same coin, and that with the right knowledge and the right technology, one could bridge the gap. They were convinced that humanity was on the cusp of a great revelation, a contact with higher intelligences, beings from other planets or perhaps other dimensions. And they were determined to be the ones to make that first contact. Their friends told police about the strange experiments conducted in a makeshift laboratory in the backyard of Miguel's home. They spoke of bizarre contraptions built from spare television parts, wires, and antennas, all designed to capture signals from the great beyond. They were trying to build a transmitter, a device to communicate with these otherworldly entities. This wasn't just talk, it was action. The neighbors could attest to it. They had complained to the police on several occasions about loud, strange explosions coming from Miguel's property. Miguel and Manuel weren't just tinkering. They were pushing the limits of their knowledge and apparently the local noise ordinances. The key to unlocking this secret world came from a single cryptic note found in Miguel's pocket. It wasn't a suicide note, not in the traditional sense. It was more like a set of instructions, a checklist for a mission. Written in Miguel's neat handwriting, it read, "For 30 p.m. be at the agreed place. 6:30 p.m. swallow capsules after effect, protect metals, await mask signal." What capsules? What effect were they expecting? Protect what metals from what? And most importantly, what was the mask signal? The note was a tantalizing piece of a puzzle that made no sense. It was a dispatch from a world with its own rules, its own language. The police now had a motive of sorts. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This wasn't a simple suicide. This was the final fatal step in a bizarre spiritual quest. The two men had willingly gone to Vintém Hill, a place known locally for UFO sightings and paranormal activity. They had followed a set of instructions, ingested something, and waited. But who gave them the instructions? And what did they believe was going to happen? The investigation led them to a man named Elcio Gomez. He was a friend of the two technicians and a fellow believer in scientific spiritualism, and he was supposed to have been with them on that hill. Elcio told the police a story that was, if anything, even stranger than the scene on Vintém Hill. He confirmed that he, Miguel, and Manuel were part of a small group dedicated to making contact with extraterrestrials. They believed that intense light and sound could trigger a connection, opening a portal or a channel of communication. Their backyard experiments, the explosions that so annoyed the neighbors, were attempts to create such a phenomenon. They were trying to build a bomb. Not a weapon of destruction, but a device of communication. A sort of spiritual firework designed to get the attention of the visitors. And according to Elcio, they had tried this before. A few years earlier, in 1963, the group had conducted a major experiment near a beach in the town of Atafona. They constructed a device and detonated it. The result was a blinding flash of light and a deafening explosion that was seen and heard for miles. But it didn't work. There was no contact, no celestial visitors, just a massive bang and a lot of scared locals. The experience, however, didn't deter them. It only convinced them that they were on the right track, that they just needed a more refined approach, a better location. Elcio explained that the trip to Vintém Hill was the culmination of years of research. They had received instructions through their spiritual sessions that this was the place, and August 17th was the time. They were told to construct lead masks to protect their eyes from the intense spiritual or extraterrestrial energy they were about to witness. The capsules, he said, were part of the process, meant to heighten their senses and prepare their bodies for the effect. He was supposed to be the third man, but a last-minute family commitment, a sense of unease he couldn't shake, had caused him to back out. It was a decision that saved his life. So now the police had a narrative. A group of men, obsessed with UFOs and spirits, build a bomb. It fails. They don't give up. They receive new mysterious instructions. They travel to a remote hill, wear bizarre lead masks, and ingest unknown capsules, all in the hope of finally meeting beings from another world. It's a compelling story, but it still doesn't explain how they died. The autopsy had found no signs of violence, no trace of poison. The capsules, whatever they were, had left no residue. The effect mentioned in the note was a complete mystery. There was no bomb crater on Vintém Hill, no evidence of the blinding light they were expecting. There was just two men, perfectly preserved, lying side by side in their Sunday best, their faces hidden behind crude, heavy masks of lead. The men had been preparing for a meeting, an ascension, a transformation. But something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. They had protected their eyes from a light that never came, and waited for a signal that never arrived. The police were no longer just investigating a death. They were investigating a failed religion, a fatal misunderstanding of the universe. And the question that hung over everything was as simple as it was terrifying. If they weren't poisoned and they weren't attacked, then what exactly killed them on that lonely hill? With no clear cause of death, investigators were staring at an impossible scenario. Two healthy men lying side by side in a remote location, dressed in their Sunday best, with no signs of violence, no poison in their systems, just dead. It was as if they had simply laid down and willed themselves to stop living. An idea that science and common sense refuses to accept. When the simplest explanations are ruled out, you're forced to look at the strange ones. And in this case, the strange evidence was all they had. The police turned their attention back to the collection of bizarre items found with the bodies. The empty water bottle, the two wet towels, the raincoats, and most importantly, the small spiral-bound notebook. This notebook would become the Rosetta Stone for this entire mystery. Inside, written in Miguel's neat, technical handwriting, were wiring diagrams and notes on electronic components, the everyday scribblings of a TV repairman. But tucked among these mundane schematics was a single page that was anything but ordinary. It was a cryptic set of instructions, a to-do list for their final day on Earth. The note read, 1630, be at the determined place. 1830, ingest capsules. After the effect, protect metals and wait for the mask signal. Suddenly, this wasn't just a random tragedy. This was a plan, a ritual. Every single word on that page was a breadcrumb leading deeper into the labyrinth. Let's break it down. 1630, be at the determined place. 4:30 in the afternoon. That lines up perfectly with the time they would have arrived at Vintém Hill. But who determined the place? Was it them? Or were they following orders from someone or something else? Then the second, more chilling instruction. 1830, ingest capsules. 6:30 in the evening. 2 hours after arriving. This was the bombshell. Capsules. This directly contradicted the toxicology report. The medical examiner had found nothing. No trace of poison, no narcotics, no barbiturates. Nothing. So what were these capsules? Were they a fast-acting poison that left no trace, something unknown to science in 1966? Or were they not poison at all? Perhaps they were something else entirely. A hallucinogen designed to open their minds, a catalyst for a spiritual journey. And what about the next part? After the effect? What effect were they waiting for? A feeling of euphoria? A physical transformation? Visions? The instruction gets even stranger. Protect metals. What on earth could that mean? Protect what metals? The electronic components they were known to carry? The fillings in their teeth? And protect them from what? Was this a reference to some kind of energy field, some powerful radiation they expected to encounter? It sounds like something pulled from the pages of a pulp science fiction magazine. Yet here it was, written down as a practical step in a real-life procedure. And finally, the climax of their mysterious ritual. Wait for the mask signal. The signal. This phrase tied everything back to those bizarre, crudely made lead masks they were found wearing. Were the masks meant to be receivers? Were they waiting for a signal to be broadcast to them through the lead? Or was the signal a cue for them to put the masks on? The ambiguity is maddening. A signal from who? God? Aliens? A third party hiding in the bushes? This single page of notes didn't solve the mystery. It exploded it into a dozen new, more complicated questions. With this checklist in hand, investigators began to painstakingly reconstruct the last 48 hours of the men's lives. They discovered that on the morning of August 17th, Manuel and Miguel told their families they were driving to Sao Paulo, about a 270-mile trip, to buy electronic parts in a car. They had a decent amount of cash on them, about 2.3 million cruzeiros, which was equivalent to around $1,000 at the time. A significant sum. But they never went to Sao Paulo. Instead, they boarded a bus at 9 a.m., not for Sao Paulo but for Niterói, a city just across the bay from Rio de Janeiro. The 2.5-hour bus ride was uneventful. They arrived in Niterói around 11:30 a.m. The first thing they did was walk straight to a store that sold electronics components. But they didn't buy anything. They told the clerk they'd be back later. From there, they went to a different kind of store, a shop that specialized in waterproof clothing. Here, they made their only known purchase of the day, 2 identical raincoats. The very same raincoats they were found wearing on the hill. Their final stop in Niterói was a small bar. They walked in, went to the counter, and bought 1 bottle of mineral water. The bartender later recalled them being in a hurry. He said one of them seemed very nervous, constantly checking his watch. They took the bottle and left. That bottle of water, purchased by 2 anxious men, was the same one found empty beside their bodies. From that bar, they walked out into the afternoon and vanished from the official record, only to reappear 24 hours later, dead on Vintém Hill, their bizarre plan apparently completed. The trail had gone cold. The police had a timeline, they had a cryptic note, but they had no motive, no suspects, and no cause of death. They were missing the context. Who were these men who would follow such a strange set of instructions to their doom? To understand that, you have to understand the world they lived in. Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana weren't just TV repairmen. They were part of a small clandestine community in their hometown of Campos dos Goitacazes, a group of men who called themselves scientific spiritualists. This wasn't a mainstream religion. It was a fringe subculture, a uniquely Brazilian cocktail of ideas that was bubbling up in the 1960s. It blended traditional Kardecist spiritualism, a popular belief system in Brazil focused on communicating with spirits, with the white-hot technological optimism of the space race and a growing obsession with UFOs. These weren't people sitting in a dark room holding hands and chanting. They saw themselves as pioneers, experimenters using technology, electronics, chemistry, radio waves, to try and bridge the gap between our world and the next. They believed they could build devices to communicate with spirits, or even make contact with extraterrestrial beings, whom they often saw as one and the same, highly evolved spirits from other planets. And Manuel and Miguel were not alone in their pursuits. Police soon learned of a third man, a friend and fellow electronics enthusiast named Elcio Gomez. When questioned, Elcio told police a story that cast a dark shadow over the events on Vintém Hill. He said that a few months prior, he, Manuel, and Miguel had conducted a similar experiment. They drove to a place called Atafona Beach, near their hometown. Their goal was to create a device that would allow them to contact Mars. They brought equipment, wires, and various chemical compounds. As they were setting up their experiment on the sand, something went terribly wrong. A powerful explosion ripped through the beach, sending a blinding flash of light into the sky and knocking all three men to the ground. The blast was so bright and loud that locals reported seeing a UFO. But it wasn't a UFO. It was Manuel and Miguel's experiment, literally blowing up in their faces. They were shaken but miraculously unhurt. This incident is critical. It proved that the two men weren't just theorists. They were actively and recklessly trying to make contact. It established a pattern of behavior, seeking out a remote location to conduct a dangerous, esoteric experiment involving strange equipment. The explosion on the beach was a failure, a dangerous miscalculation. But it didn't stop them. It only made them more determined. What had they learned from that fiery mistake? And what new, even more dangerous plan did it lead them to on that rainy afternoon in Rio? They had learned that their theories weren't just theories anymore. The explosion on the beach wasn't a failure in their minds. It was a confirmation. It proved that the materials they were working with, the formulas they were deciphering, had real, tangible power. Dangerous power. The problem wasn't the science or the spirituality, or whatever you want to call it. The problem was the location. It was too public, too exposed, too earthly. They needed a place with the right energy, a place of power, a place closer to the sky. They needed a location that was isolated, elevated, and shielded from prying eyes. They needed Vintém Hill. 2 months later, on the morning of August 17, 1966, Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel José Viana said goodbye to their families. The story they sold was a simple one, believable enough for two electronics technicians who were always looking for a good deal. They were heading to Sao Paulo, they said, to buy a used Volkswagen Beetle and some materials for their workshop. It was a multi-day trip, so no one should worry if they were gone for a little while. To sell the lie, they packed a small suitcase and took with them a significant amount of cash, about 2,300,000 old cruzeiros. In today's money, that's roughly $2,000. Enough to buy a car, certainly, but also enough to fund whatever strange expedition they were truly planning. Their wives had no reason to doubt them. The men were responsible, hard-working providers. This was just another business trip. But as the two men walked out the door that morning, they left behind more than just their families. They left behind their old lives, stepping onto a path from which they would never return. They boarded a bus, not for Sao Paulo, but for Niterói, the city that sits just across the Guanabara Bay from Rio de Janeiro. The journey took several hours, a rumbling, rattling trip through the Brazilian countryside. We can only imagine what was going through their minds. Was it excitement? Fear? The unshakable conviction of true believers on the verge of a breakthrough? They were leaving the familiar world behind, traveling towards a date with something they believed was waiting for them on a remote, rain-swept hill. They arrived in Niterói around 2:30 in the afternoon. The sky was gray and heavy with the promise of a storm. Their first stop was a local shop where they purchased 2 waterproof raincoats. A sensible purchase given the weather. But was it just for the rain? Or did they believe they needed protection from something else? Something more than water? From the same shop, they bought a single bottle of magnesium-rich mineral water. They then walked to a small, unassuming bar near the bus station. This would be the last place they were seen alive by anyone who would speak to them. The bartender, a man named Raoul, would later recall the two men vividly. They didn't order any alcohol, just the bottle of water they had just bought. They asked him to open it for them, which he did. He remembered them being incredibly agitated, nervous. Miguel in particular kept glancing at his watch, as if he were running late for the most important appointment of his life. The minutes ticked by. They seemed to be waiting. But for what? Or for whom? After some time, Miguel paid the bill, and the bartender returned his change. Miguel, in his haste or anxiety, left the receipt on the counter. And on the back of that receipt, police would later find a note. A note that would become one of the most cryptic and obsessed-over clues in the entire case. It wasn't a suicide note. It wasn't a confession. It was a set of instructions. A bizarre to-do list for the apocalypse. Written in Miguel's neat handwriting, it read, 4:30 p.m. Be at the determined location. 6:30 p.m. Ingest capsules. After effect, protect metals and await mask signal. Let's break that down. 4:30 p.m. Be at the determined location. This was their deadline. This is why Miguel was so obsessed with his watch. The location police were certain had to be Vintém Hill. They were on a strict, non-negotiable schedule. 6:30 p.m. Ingest capsules. 2 hours after arriving. What capsules? Police never found any pill bottles, no blister packs, no remnants of any medication at the scene or in their belongings. Were these drugs, poison, or something else entirely? Something they believed would prepare their bodies for what was coming. The note continued. After effect. This is perhaps the most chilling part. It implies they knew the capsules would do something to them. They were anticipating a physical or psychological reaction, a change, a transformation. Then, protect metals. What metals? The small bits of electronic equipment in their workshop? Or the metals on their own bodies? Their watches, their belt buckles? Why would they need protection? And finally, the most enigmatic instruction of all. Await mask signal. A signal. Someone or something was supposed to give them a sign. A signal to do what? To put on the masks? Was that the final step? The key that unlocked the door to another dimension? This note wasn't the ramblings of a madman. It was a procedure. A step-by-step guide for a ritual. A ritual they had likely practiced, refined, and were now ready to execute for the final time. After leaving the bar, receipt and its cryptic message left behind, Manuel and Miguel were spotted one last time. A local security guard saw two men matching their descriptions walking purposefully towards the trail that led up Vintém Hill. The rain had started to fall, a cold, persistent drizzle that would soon turn into a torrential downpour. The guard thought it was strange. Nobody went up Vintém Hill in this kind of weather, especially not this late in the day. The hill was known to be a desolate, even dangerous place, a patchwork of dense forest and rocky clearings. But the two men didn't hesitate. They were dressed in their suits, now covered by their brand new raincoats, carrying a small bag. They walked up the muddy path and disappeared into the thick, wet foliage. They were following their schedule. They had to be at the determined location by 4:30 p.m. As they climbed, the city of Niterói fell away below them, its lights beginning to blur in the gathering storm. They were leaving the world of logic, of commerce, of family, and entering a different realm. A place where lead masks offered protection from unknown forces and strange capsules promised a profound after effect. They were ascending into the heart of their own mystery. They reached their chosen spot, a small flat clearing shielded by vegetation, with a commanding view of the bay. They were on time. 4:30 p.m. Now all they had to do was wait. Wait for the next step on their list. Wait for 6:30. Wait for the signal. But as the storm clouds thickened and the rain lashed down, what kind of signal were they truly expecting? And was it a signal that ever came? That is the central haunting question of this entire case. The signal. What was it supposed to be? A flash of light? A sound? A feeling? To understand the answer, or at least the answer Miguel and Manuel believed in, we have to pull back from the grim discovery on Vintém Hill and look at the men themselves. We have to dive headfirst into their secret world. A world of esoteric beliefs, strange experiments, and a deep, unshakable conviction that humanity was on the verge of a new kind of contact. This wasn't just a casual hobby for them. This was their life's work. Miguel and Manuel were part of a small clandestine group in their hometown of Campos dos Goitacazes. On the surface, they were just electronics technicians, but in their spare time, they were what they called scientific spiritualists. It was a fringe belief system, a bizarre cocktail of ufology, spiritism, and homespun electronics. They believed that by combining spiritual purity with technical know-how, they could make contact with extraterrestrial or interdimensional beings. They weren't just waiting for aliens to land on the White House lawn. They were actively building devices, conducting rituals, and trying to punch a hole through the veil of reality. One of their core beliefs was that they were on the cusp of receiving a great secret from these otherworldly entities, a secret that would advance humanity, but to receive it, they had to prove they were worthy. They had to follow a strict set of instructions, a cosmic protocol. And central to that protocol was withstanding an encounter with a light. Not just any light, but a blinding, unbearably intense light that would accompany the final signal. This light, they believed, was so powerful, so full of energy and radiation, that it would be lethal to the unprotected eye. And that right there is the key. That's why they needed the masks. The crude, hand-cut lead masks weren't for a robbery. They weren't a disguise. In their minds, they were essential protective gear, like spiritual sunglasses, designed to shield their eyes from the divine radioactive glare of their cosmic appointment. This theory didn't just materialize out of thin air. It came directly from the testimony of a man named Elcio Correa Gomez. Elcio was a friend of the two men and a fellow believer, and as police would soon discover, he was the last person to see them alive and well. When investigators tracked him down, his story blew the case wide open. He told them that on August 17th, the day they disappeared, Miguel and Manuel had told him they had a crucial mission to complete. They said they were going to Sao Paulo to buy materials for a new television antenna and a car. But Elcio knew this was a cover story. Their real destination was Niterói, and their real purpose was to meet their destiny on Vintém Hill. Elcio recounted the trip. He drove them to the bus station. He described them as being visibly excited, but also tense, as if they were about to take the most important exam of their lives. Miguel was carrying the briefcase with the money, and both were dressed in their new suits. They told Elcio that this was it. Everything they had been working towards was about to happen. They promised that once their experiment was a success, they would return, and everyone in their group would know the truth. They were pioneers venturing into the unknown. But Elcio's testimony gets even stranger. He admitted that this wasn't the first time they had attempted such a ritual. A few months earlier, the three of them had conducted a similar experiment at a beach in Atafona. They had built a strange device in Miguel's backyard, a contraption of tubes and wires they believed could capture and amplify spiritual frequencies. They took this device to the beach, and according to Elcio, there was a sudden violent explosion. No one was hurt, but the device was destroyed. The experiment was a failure. Miguel and Manuel, however, were not deterred. They saw it as a learning experience. They believed the failure was due to a flaw in their process, not a flaw in their beliefs. This time on Vintém Hill, they were convinced they had it right. They had received new, more precise instructions. And those instructions were written down, right there in the small notebook found next to Manuel's body. When police finally deciphered the cryptic text, it wasn't a suicide note. It was a checklist, a step-by-step guide for their otherworldly encounter. It read, 4:30 p.m. Be at the designated location. 6:30 p.m. Ingest capsules. After effect, protect metals and await mask signal. Suddenly, the random collection of items found at the scene snapped into focus. It was their ritual kit. The waterproof coats were to protect them from the storm. The empty water bottle was likely to help them swallow the capsules. The time, 6:30 p.m., was the moment of commitment. But what were these capsules? And what was the effect they were supposed to have? Police had a chilling theory. The men believed that to make contact, their bodies needed to be in a heightened, altered state of consciousness. The capsules were likely a powerful hallucinogenic drug, maybe a psychedelic, meant to open their minds to the signal. They would take the drug, and as it took hold, the after effect, they would put on their lead masks and wait for the intense light. This explains their calm demeanor at the bar, their methodical preparation. They weren't scared. They were following a script they believed was handed down from a higher intelligence. Every action had a purpose, but it also raises a terrifying possibility. What if the capsules weren't what they thought they were? What if the effect wasn't a spiritual awakening, but something far more final? The autopsy had found no obvious signs of violence, no trauma, but it also hadn't found any trace of poison. However, the medical examiner noted that due to the advanced state of decomposition, and the fact that the internal organs had been removed and sent away for more detailed analysis, many common poisons could have been missed in the initial examination. The investigators were now facing two distinct paths. One path led to a simple, tragic overdose. Two men, high on a cocktail of drugs and esoteric beliefs, who went up a hill, took a lethal dose of something and died, with the storm masking their final moments. It's a clean, simple explanation, but it doesn't quite fit. Why the elaborate preparations? Why the huge sum of cash if they planned to die? And if it was an accidental overdose, it's an incredible coincidence that it happened to both men, at the same time, with no signs of struggle. The other path was far darker and more complex. It suggested that Miguel and Manuel were not alone in their beliefs, or perhaps not alone on that hill. The scientific spiritualism group they belonged to was secretive. What if the instructions they were following came not from the stars, but from another person? Someone who supplied them with the capsules, knowing full well they contained a lethal poison. Someone who convinced them they were embarking on a spiritual journey, when in reality they were being led to their deaths. The money in the briefcase suddenly looks less like a fund for a new car and more like a payment. A payment for ascension. A payment for a secret that was never meant to be shared, only sold. The mystery was no longer just about what happened to two men on a hill. It was about who, if anyone, sent them there. And as investigators stared at that cryptic note, the pieces started to click into place. This wasn't a suicide pact born of desperation. This was a transaction. A carefully planned step-by-step procedure for which Miguel and Manuel had paid a significant sum. The question that now burned in the minds of the police was simple. Who was on the receiving end of that payment? Who was the architect of this fatal appointment? The answer, they suspected, lay back in Campos dos Goitacazes, within a small insular community of electronics technicians who dabbled in something far more esoteric than repairing radios. This was the world of scientific spiritualism, a fringe movement that blended pseudoscience, ufology, and traditional spiritism into a uniquely Brazilian cocktail of belief. And at the center of it, a man named Elcio Gomez. Elcio was a friend of the two men. He ran in the same circles, shared their passion for electronics, and most importantly, fueled their obsession with the paranormal. According to friends and family, Elcio was the leader of their small group. He was the one who claimed to have the knowledge, the one who conducted the experiments, the one who promised a gateway to a higher plane of existence. He was, for all intents and purposes, their guru. When police began interviewing people who knew Miguel and Manuel, Elcio's name came up again and again. They learned that the two men had become increasingly consumed by his teachings. They weren't just hobbyists anymore. They were disciples. They had told family members about a final test they needed to pass, a secret mission that would culminate in a profound revelation. This mission, they were told, was dangerous. It required absolute secrecy and unwavering faith. Elcio, it seemed, was the one who had given them the mission. The story that emerged was one of escalating fanaticism. The group would gather in the backyard of another member, Hamilton Bezerreo, to conduct their experiments. These weren't seances with candles and Ouija boards. They were bizarre, quasi-scientific rituals. They would build strange electronic devices, convinced they could communicate with spirits or aliens. And they would conduct explosive tests. Yes, explosives. This wasn't just some harmless spiritual club. This group was building homemade bombs. They would take them to a remote beach near their town and detonate them. Why? According to Elcio, the intense light and sound from the explosions were necessary to attract the attention of the beings they were trying to contact. They believed the flash and the boom would act as a cosmic beacon, signaling their readiness to make contact. Miguel and Manuel were key participants in these dangerous experiments. They were the electronics experts, the ones who helped design and build the devices. They weren't just followers, they were true believers, investing their time, their skills, and ultimately, their lives in Elcio's vision. One witness, a friend of the group, told police a chilling story. Months before the men's deaths, he was present for one of these explosive tests. An argument broke out. The device they had built was more powerful than they anticipated, and some members were getting scared. They were worried about the police about getting hurt. But Miguel, usually so calm and rational, was furious. He shouted that there was no turning back. He said they were on the verge of discovering a great truth, and that anyone who backed out now was a coward. The witness said he saw a fire in Miguel's eyes he'd never seen before. It was the look of a man who had left the rational world far behind. With this testimony, the police had a prime suspect and a motive. They believed Elcio Gomez, possibly with the help of Hamilton, had convinced Miguel and Manuel that they could achieve some form of spiritual enlightenment or make contact with extraterrestrials. He had given them a set of instructions, the note found in Miguel's pocket, and sent them to Vintém Hill for the final fateful experiment. The money from the Volkswagen sale was likely the fee for this ultimate secret. Elcio wasn't just a spiritual leader. He was a con man who had led two vulnerable men to their deaths. The case seemed to be closing in. Police located Elcio Gomez and brought him in for questioning. They confronted him with the evidence. The witness statements, the stories of the explosive experiments, his role as the group's leader. They expected him to deny everything, to feign ignorance. But Elcio didn't deny it. In fact, he confirmed most of it. Yes, he was the leader of a spiritualist group. Yes, they performed experiments. Yes, he believed in communicating with beings from other dimensions. But then his story took a sharp, unbelievable turn. He claimed that he was supposed to be on that hill with them. According to Elcio, the plan was for all three of them, himself, Miguel, and Manuel, to go to Vintém Hill that day. It wasn't just a mission for the two technicians. It was a pivotal event for their entire group. He told the police that the purpose of the trip was to witness a UFO. He claimed they had received a psychic message, a premonition, that a craft would appear over the hill at a specific time. The lead masks were for protection against the intense radiation or light they expected the craft to emit. The capsules, he explained, were to be taken at the moment of contact, to enhance their psychic senses and facilitate communication with the beings on board. It was a wild, fantastical story, but he told it with the unnerving calm of a man who believed every single word. The police were skeptical. If he was supposed to be there, why wasn't he? Elcio's answer was simple, almost mundane. He said the group had become too popular. Word of their experiments had spread, and too many people wanted in on the final test. He felt the energy was wrong, that the presence of so many newcomers would disrupt the delicate frequency required for contact. So, he told Miguel and Manuel to go without him, to complete the mission as a duo. He claimed he had no idea they would die. He insisted he sent them there to witness a miracle, not to meet their end. His story was a confounding mix of confession and deflection. He admitted to orchestrating the event but denied any malicious intent. To him, this wasn't a crime. It was a spiritual exercise that had gone tragically, inexplicably wrong. He couldn't explain the poison. He claimed the capsules he knew of contained only harmless vitamins or herbs. The presence of a deadly toxin was a mystery to him, a horrifying deviation from the plan. The police were now faced with an impossible situation. Their prime suspect had essentially confessed to sending the men to their deaths, but his motive wasn't greed or malice. It was faith, a bizarre, dangerous faith, but faith nonetheless. How do you prosecute a man who claims he was trying to help his friends meet aliens, not kill them? The line between cult leader and cold-blooded killer was becoming impossibly blurred. And just when the investigators thought the story couldn't get any stranger, Elcio Gomez dropped another bombshell. He looked the detectives dead in the eye and told them that the strange object they were supposed to see, the UFO, wasn't from another planet. It was from another dimension, and it wasn't just a vehicle. He said they were going to Vintém Hill to meet an entity they had been communicating with for years. An entity they knew by a very specific and very chilling name. The entity they called the King. This wasn't some vague spiritual guide. According to the friend Hamilton, this was a specific intelligent being from another dimension who had chosen Miguel and Manuel, along with a few others, for a special purpose. And the man who introduced them to this King? A television repairman from a nearby town named Elcio Gomez. Elcio was the charismatic, self-proclaimed leader of their small, clandestine group. They called themselves scientific spiritualists. It was a fringe belief system, a cocktail of Cartesian spiritism, which was popular in Brazil, mixed with a heavy dose of 1960s UFO mania and amateur electronics. They believed that with the right technology and the right spiritual frequency, They could bridge the gap between our world and others. They weren't just trying to talk to spirits of the dead. They were trying to dial into the cosmic network to make contact with advanced, non-human intelligences. And Elcio claimed he had done it. He was the conduit, the one who received the messages from the king. The others, including Miguel and Manuel, were his devoted acolytes. They would gather in secret, conducting seances where they would allegedly receive complex technical schematics and philosophical guidance from this interdimensional entity. Their ultimate goal was to prove the existence of these other worlds and to become emissaries for humanity. This is where the backyard explosion suddenly makes a terrifying amount of sense. It wasn't just a couple of guys messing around with chemicals. It was an assignment. According to the group's beliefs, the king had transmitted the plans for a device, a machine that would generate a specific frequency, a sort of beacon to stabilize a connection with its dimension. Miguel and Manuel, the electronics experts, were tasked with building it. The explosion that rocked Campos dos Goitacazes, the one that left Miguel with burns on his hands and face, wasn't an accident. It was a failure. A critical, high-stakes failure. The group believed the device had overloaded, creating a violent energy discharge. They were devastated, not because of the danger but because they had failed their mission. They had failed the king. For months after the explosion, the group was in disarray. They believed the failure had set them back, that they had lost their chance. But then, a new message allegedly came through from Elcio. A message of redemption. The king was offering them another chance. A different path. Not through technology but through a direct physical meeting. It would be a final test of their faith and courage. If they passed, they would achieve what they had always dreamed of, transcendence. They would become part of the higher dimensional world themselves. The location for this final test was a place of high energy, a place where the veil between worlds was thin. Vintém Hill. And so, the trip to Niterói wasn't a business trip. It was a pilgrimage. Every step they took, from buying the raincoats to boarding that bus, was part of a meticulously planned ritual. They weren't going to buy a car. They were going to ascend. This brings us back to the most critical piece of evidence in the entire case. The small, water-damaged notebook found with the bodies. In it, among the electronic schematics and lists of parts, was one single cryptic entry. A set of instructions. It read, 1630B at the determined place. 1830 swallow capsules after the effect, protect metals and wait for the mask signal. Let's break that down because this single note is the key. 1630B at the determined place. That's 4:30 p.m. This matches perfectly with the testimony of the young boy who saw them climbing the hill. They were right on schedule. The determined place was clearly the spot where their bodies were later found. 1830 swallow capsules. 6:30 p.m. The sun would have been setting, casting long shadows across the hill. This is where the mystery deepens. What were these capsules? The autopsies found no trace of any known poison or drug, but 1960s toxicology was primitive compared to today. Could it have been a fast-acting esoteric poison that left no trace? Or perhaps a powerful designer hallucinogen meant to open their minds to the other side? Some researchers believe the capsules might not have been poison at all, but something else entirely. Something intended to induce a specific biological state, a deep trance preparing their bodies for something. The lack of any struggle, the peaceful way they were found, suggests that whatever they took it willingly, expecting a positive outcome. Then comes the strangest instruction of all. After the effect, protect metals. What in the world does that mean? The men had no significant metal on them, other than maybe pocket change or a watch. Some theories suggest this was a warning against some kind of energy discharge they were expecting. The entity, the king, was perhaps not a biological being but a creature of pure energy. An arrival could be accompanied by a powerful electromagnetic pulse, one that could heat metal to incandescent temperatures. It's a concept straight out of science fiction, but it fits their scientific spiritualist beliefs. Another theory is more symbolic. In some esoteric traditions, metals are believed to ground a person to the physical world. Protecting metals could have been a coded instruction to shed their final connections to our reality, to let go of all earthly attachments. Or perhaps it was simpler. The lead masks themselves were the metals they needed to protect, or protect themselves with. And that leads to the final chilling command. Wait for the mask signal. This is the climax of their ritual. The lead masks. They weren't for radiation, not in the way we think of it. They were receivers, or perhaps filters. The men believed that the entity they were about to meet would manifest as an intense, blinding light. A light so powerful it would be lethal to the naked eye. The thick, crude lead masks were their only protection. They were instructed to put on the masks and lie down side by side in total darkness, an act of complete and total trust. They were to wait for a signal. What was the signal supposed to be? A flash of light that would be visible even through the dense lead? A sound? A mental command? Whatever it was supposed to be their cue. The final step in their journey. The moment of their ascension. So picture it. Two men lying on their backs on a remote, windswept hill as night falls. The city of Rio de Janeiro glitters far below, a world away. They've followed every instruction to the letter. They've ingested the mysterious capsules and are now feeling their effect. Their hearts are probably pounding with a mixture of terror and ecstatic anticipation. They place the cold, heavy lead masks over their faces, plunging themselves into absolute blackness. They are utterly vulnerable, lying there in the grass, waiting for a signal from another dimension, waiting for the king. But what if the signal never came? Or what if the effect of the capsules wasn't what they expected? What if the instructions they had followed so faithfully were not a pathway to enlightenment, but a meticulously designed death trap? As they lay there in the dark, unable to see, their senses altered by the capsules, what really happened in those final terrifying hours on Vintém Hill? To understand what might have happened, we have to pull back from the world of interdimensional beings and secret societies, and look at the case through a much colder, more cynical lens. A lens that sees human greed, deception, and violence. Let's entertain a chilling possibility, that Miguel and Manuel were not alone on that hill, that they were murdered. This isn't just a wild guess. It's a theory built on the one piece of evidence that makes no sense in a spiritual context: the money. The large sum of cash found on their bodies. Why would you bring the equivalent of thousands of dollars to a rendezvous with extraterrestrials or a meeting to ascend to a higher plane of existence? Spiritual enlightenment is supposed to be priceless. But illegal goods, technology, information, that has a price tag. This is where the story takes a dark turn, into the criminal underworld of 1960s Brazil. At the time, the country was under a military dictatorship, which meant strict controls on imports. High-tech electronics, the very field Miguel and Manuel specialized in, were incredibly difficult and expensive to get legally. This created a thriving and very dangerous black market. Smugglers, or contrabandistas, would bring in everything from radios to television components, selling them for a massive profit. Now look at our two men again. They weren't just spiritual seekers, they were skilled electronics technicians. They had a side business repairing televisions and other devices. They would have known the value of these components. They would have known the people who dealt in them. What if their scientific spiritualism was a cover? Or, more likely, what if their genuine spiritual beliefs were exploited by someone with a criminal agenda? Imagine a scenario. A charismatic figure, someone who speaks their language of frequencies, vibrations, and cosmic energies, approaches them. This person doesn't talk about ascending to heaven. They talk about acquiring a new revolutionary piece of technology, something not of this world. Maybe it's a powerful radio transmitter that can contact other dimensions, or a device that generates immense energy. The seller could have framed it in spiritual terms to gain their trust, calling it a cosmic secret or a gift from an advanced civilization. But in reality, it was just a piece of highly sought-after, smuggled electronic equipment. The instructions in the notebook suddenly read very differently. 4:30 p.m., be at the agreed place. 6:30 p.m., ingest capsules. This no longer sounds like a spiritual ritual. It sounds like the precise instructions for a clandestine meeting, a black market deal. The location, Vintém Hill, is perfect. It's isolated, difficult to access, and offers a clear view of the surrounding area, making it easy to spot if you're being followed. And the capsules? In the suicide or accidental overdose theory, they are the agents of death. But in a murder scenario, they are something else entirely. They could have been a sedative. The dealers, wanting to ensure a smooth, risk-free transaction, might have told Miguel and Manuel that the capsules were necessary to attune their bodies to the frequency of the device they were buying. A bit of scientific-sounding nonsense to mask a simple, brutal goal: to drug them, to make them compliant, to make them easy to rob. This theory paints a horrifying picture. Miguel and Manuel, filled with excitement and anticipation, follow the instructions perfectly. They arrive at the spot. They swallow the capsules, believing they are preparing for a profound experience. Then they lie down, put on their lead masks, perhaps told it was to protect them from the radiation of the powerful device, and wait. And as the drug takes hold, as their senses dull and consciousness begins to fade, their spiritual guides arrive. But they haven't come to deliver cosmic secrets. They've come to take the money. They see the two men incapacitated, helpless. They take the cash and then they have a choice. They can leave them there, hoping they just sleep it off and wake up confused and robbed, or they can make sure there are no witnesses. This is where the lack of violence on the bodies becomes a point of contention. But remember, the initial autopsies were compromised by the state of the bodies, and the second, more thorough autopsy did find evidence of visceral hemorrhaging, which some toxicologists argue could be consistent with certain fast-acting, hard-to-detect poisons. It's possible the capsules contain not just a sedative, but a lethal cocktail, or perhaps something else happened, something that left no obvious trace. Maybe they were suffocated, a method that can be difficult to detect in a decomposed body. The criminals take the money, ensure the men are dead or dying, and simply walk away, leaving behind a scene so bizarre that police would be baffled for decades. This criminal theory neatly explains the money, the location, and the strange instructions. It turns the notebook from a spiritual text into a set of instructions for a deal gone wrong. It also provides a motive that is depressingly common: greed. And there might even be a suspect. Remember Elcio Correa Gomez? The friend who claimed Miguel and Manuel met a blonde man and were involved in a secret mission? His story is full of inconsistencies. He was one of the last people to see them alive. He was with them when they bought the waterproof raincoats. He knew they were carrying a large sum of money. After their disappearance, Elcio reportedly seemed nervous and agitated. When questioned by police, he gave conflicting accounts of their plans. Was Elcio a concerned friend? Or was he part of the setup? Did he, perhaps unknowingly, lead his friends into a trap? Or was he a willing accomplice, feeding them a story about a secret mission to lure them to Vintém Hill with their life savings? He told police that the group was supposed to detonate a bomb as part of their mission, and that he backed out because he was afraid. This detail is incredibly strange. Was it a lie to make himself seem innocent? Or was he hinting at the violent nature of the people they were about to meet? Police investigated Elcio thoroughly, but could never find enough evidence to charge him. He remains a shadowy figure in the case, a man who knew more than he let on. This theory transforms the case from a metaphysical mystery into a tragic story of human cruelty. It suggests that Miguel and Manuel weren't just victims of their own strange beliefs, but victims of predators who wore the mask of enlightenment. These predators saw two men who were intelligent, but also deeply naive. Men who so desperately wanted to believe in something more that they were willing to hand over their money, and ultimately their lives, to a lie. They weren't meeting aliens on a hilltop. They were meeting criminals in a makeshift office, and the transaction was their own execution. The lead masks in this light become the ultimate symbol of their tragedy. Not a shield against cosmic rays, but a blindfold. A tool used by their killers to complete the illusion, to keep them docile and unaware until the very end. They died not seeing the face of God, but blinded to the face of their own murderers. This theory might lack the cosmic wonder of the others, but it replaces it with something far more chilling and real: the darkness that can hide behind a human smile and a promise of salvation. But even if we accept this brutal reality, a key question remains. If they were poisoned, what was the poison? The search for this elusive substance would lead investigators down a rabbit hole of toxicology and forensic science, revealing just how easy it was, and still is, to get away with the perfect murder. The problem was, in 1966, toxicology was a blunt instrument. Today, a lab can run a sample through a gas chromatograph mass spectrometer, a machine that can separate a substance into its individual components and identify them with incredible precision. It's like a chemical fingerprint scanner. But in the 60s, investigators didn't have that luxury. They had to know what they were looking for. The process was more like a series of yes or no questions. Did they ingest arsenic? No. Did they ingest cyanide? No. Strychnine? No. The lab technicians ran tests for all the common known poisons of the era, and every single one came back negative. This is the first major roadblock that transforms this case from a strange suicide into a potential masterclass in murder. If you don't know what poison to test for, you will never find it. The human body is a complex chemical factory. After death, the process of decomposition creates a cocktail of new organic compounds. A poison, especially a sophisticated one, could easily break down into constituent parts that are indistinguishable from the body's own natural chemistry. Or it could be a substance so obscure, so rare, that the chemists in Rio de Janeiro wouldn't even have a baseline sample to compare it against. The killer, if there was one, wouldn't need to be a criminal mastermind. They would just need to be a competent chemist. So what could it have been? The list of candidates is chilling. There are plant-based alkaloids, like digitalis from the common foxglove plant. A concentrated dose can cause cardiac arrest, and in an autopsy, the victim's heart would simply look like it failed. No telltale signs. There are nerve agents or paralytics like succinylcholine. This is a particularly terrifying possibility. Succinylcholine is a muscle relaxant used in surgery. In a high dose, it paralyzes every muscle in the body, including the diaphragm. The victim is left completely conscious, unable to move, unable to breathe, until they asphyxiate. It mimics a heart attack, and crucially, the substance breaks down in the body within minutes into chemicals that are naturally present anyway. It's a ghost. A perfect, untraceable weapon that would explain why two strong men simply lay down on a hillside and died without a single mark of struggle. This possibility reframes the entire scene on Vintém Hill. Miguel and Manuel weren't peacefully drifting into another dimension. They could have been lying there wide awake, looking up at the sky through the eye holes of their lead masks, fully aware that their lungs had stopped working, waiting for a death that was both terrifyingly slow and agonizingly fast. The raincoats would have protected their bodies from the elements, just as planned. The masks would have protected them from the radiation, just as planned. But the poison, the very thing meant to be the key to their journey, was a trap. Let's look at their cryptic note again. 1630. Be at the agreed place. 1830. Ingest capsules after the effect, protect metals, await mask signal. The sequence of events is critical. Ingest capsules after the effect. This is the line that has baffled everyone. What effect? What were they supposed to experience before taking the capsules? The common interpretation is that something external was supposed to happen, a flash of light, a sound, the arrival of a UFO, and then they would take the capsules. But what if the note is written from a flawed understanding? What if they were given two substances? Imagine a scenario. A third party, the architect of this whole affair, gives them a liquid or a powder. They're told this is the first step. Take this at 6:30, he says. You will feel a strange effect, a tingling, a sense of euphoria. This is the beginning of the transition. Once you feel it, take these capsules to complete the process and protect your bodies. But the liquid isn't a hallucinogen. It's a fast-acting, lethal poison. The effect they were told to wait for was the poison taking hold. The tingling sensation wasn't transcendence. It was their nervous system shutting down. They lay down, protecting the metals, the money, and waiting for the mask signal. A signal that would never come, because the capsules in their pocket were the antidote. Or perhaps the capsules were just a placebo, a prop in a deadly stage play. They died waiting for the cue to take the very thing that might have saved them, or that they believed would take them to the next level. This theory transforms the case from a double suicide into a cold, calculated double murder. Miguel and Manuel weren't just victims of their own strange beliefs. They were victims of a predator. Someone who understood their esoteric desires, their belief in scientific spiritualism, and used that faith against them. This person could have sold them on a grand cosmic journey, promising them a meeting with extraterrestrials or entry into a higher dimension. The lead masks, the specific time, the location on the hill, it all could have been part of an elaborate set of instructions designed to look like a mystical ritual, but with the practical purpose of getting them to a secluded spot and ingesting poison without a fight. And the money? The 2 million cruzeros they were carrying? It was gone. While police found a small amount of cash in the pocket of one of the raincoats, the large sum they had withdrawn from the bank was never recovered. In this light, the motive becomes brutally simple. Robbery. A con man, perhaps Elcio Gomez or someone else entirely, learned of their quest and their savings. He played the part of a guru, a contact to the other side. He gave them the poison, took their money and walked away, leaving 2 men in lead masks to die on a hill, their deaths wrapped in so much high strangeness that no one would ever think to look for a simple, greedy killer. The case of the lead masks becomes a chilling example of how belief can be weaponized. The poison wasn't just a chemical compound. It was the story that came with it. The promise of cosmic secrets was the sugar that made the medicine go down. And it worked perfectly. It created a crime scene so bizarre, so full of paranormal red herrings, that it sent the investigation spiraling into the world of UFOs and spirits, far away from the simple, ugly truth of a robbery homicide. The killer didn't just erase the evidence of the poison from their bodies, he erased himself from the entire narrative. But this theory, as clean as it is, still leaves nagging questions. If it was just a robbery, why the lead masks? Why not just take their money and shoot them? Why the elaborate theatrical setup? Was it just to create confusion, or was the ritual itself part of the killer's own bizarre pathology? And there's still the matter of the witnesses who saw them with another man. The description of this third man was vague. Some said he was fair-haired, others said he was darker. He was a ghost, too. A phantom who appears in the story just long enough to plant a seed of doubt and then vanishes. The search for a physical poison had hit a dead end, confounded by the limits of science and the passage of time. But perhaps the most lethal poison of all isn't one that attacks the body, but one that hijacks the mind. And this is where the story pivots from a physical crime scene to a psychological one. The most compelling theory, the one that ties all the bizarre threads together, isn't about murder or robbery. It's about a belief system so powerful, it could lead two intelligent, skilled men to lie down on a remote hill and wait for death. This was the world of scientific spiritualism, a fringe movement that swept through parts of Brazil in the 1960s. This wasn't your typical seance with flickering candles. It was a strange fusion of Cold War-era technological obsession, UFO mania, and esoteric spirituality. Adherents believed that they could use scientific principles and electronic devices to communicate with spirits and even extraterrestrial beings. They were convinced that humanity was on the verge of a great spiritual leap, and they, the chosen few, would be the pioneers. Manuel and Miguel were not just dabblers. They were deep in it. They were part of a small, intense group in their hometown of Campos dos Goitacazes. And at the center of this group was a man named Elcio Gomez. Elcio was the charismatic guru, the one who claimed to have the answers. He was the one who allegedly received instructions from these higher beings. Friends and family later reported that Manuel and Miguel had become obsessed, pouring their time and a significant amount of their money into building strange electronic devices in their workshop, all in an attempt to make contact. This is where the puzzle pieces start to click into place. The trip to Sao Paulo wasn't to buy a car. It was to buy electronic components for their experiments. The large sum of money they carried wasn't for a personal purchase. It was the group's funds, meant to further their spiritual scientific quest. They were on a mission, not a vacation. According to this theory, their final journey to Vintém Hill was the culmination of everything they had been working towards. It was the final exam. Elcio had allegedly given them a set of precise instructions for a dangerous, high-stakes experiment designed to trigger a definitive contact with an otherworldly intelligence. Let's look at the note again, not as a suicide pact, but as a flight checklist for a journey to another dimension. For 30 p.m. be at the determined place. They arrived on time. 6:30 p.m. ingest capsules. This is the critical, fatal step. The belief is that these capsules contained a substance, likely a powerful psychedelic or a potent sedative. The purpose wasn't to kill them. It was to alter their consciousness, to lower their psychic frequency, to make them receptive to the signal from the other side. They were preparing their minds for a transcendent experience. And what about the rest of the note? After the effect, protect metals, wait for the mask signal. Protect metals is cryptic, but within this belief system, it could mean anything from protecting their dental fillings to shielding the electronic equipment they believed they were interfacing with. And wait for the mask signal. This is the key. The lead masks weren't a disguise. They were a tool. In the world of 1960s sci-fi and spiritualism, there was a pervasive fear and fascination with radiation, atomic radiation, cosmic rays, and in this case, a kind of spiritual or psychic radiation that would be emitted during the contact event. The lead masks were their protection, their spiritual hazmat suits, to be donned at the final moment when the signal came. So picture the scene. Two true believers, hearts pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. They followed the instructions to the letter. They're on the sacred hill, a known hotspot for UFO sightings. At 6:30 p.m., as the sun begins to set, they swallow the capsules, trusting completely in the process. They lie down on the beds of leaves they prepared side by side, awaiting the transformation. They are not waiting for death. They are waiting for a revelation. They are waiting for a spaceship. They are waiting for God. But the signal never comes. The capsules, whatever they contained, were far too powerful. Perhaps they were given the wrong substance. Perhaps they miscalculated the dosage. Perhaps their bodies simply had a fatal reaction. Instead of their consciousness expanding, their respiratory systems began to shut down. There was no struggle, no panic, because the sedative effect was overwhelming. They simply drifted away. A spiritual experiment gone horribly, tragically wrong. It wasn't a double suicide. It was a double overdose, an accidental death in the pursuit of the divine. This theory explains everything. It explains the lack of violence. It explains why the money was left untouched. It explains the bizarre ritualistic items, the masks, the note, the raincoats. It explains their calm, peaceful expressions. They died in a state of hopeful anticipation. But it leaves one giant burning question. What about Elcio Gomez, the man who allegedly gave them the instructions? When police tracked him down, he denied everything. He admitted knowing the men and being part of their spiritualist group, but he claimed he had no idea about their final experiment. He insisted he never gave them any dangerous instructions or deadly capsules. With no physical evidence linking him to the scene and no proof he supplied a poison, police had nothing to hold him on. Was Elcio a cynical conman who sent two of his followers to their deaths, perhaps to get rid of them or to fake a miracle? Or was he a true believer himself, just as deluded as they were, who gave them flawed instructions he genuinely thought would work? We will never know. Years after the incident, a friend of Elcio's came forward, claiming Elcio had confessed his role, expressing deep guilt over the stupid mistake that cost his friends their lives. But this was hearsay, inadmissible in court. Elcio Gomez was never charged, and so the case remains officially unsolved. A frustrating, open-ended mystery. The police files list the cause of death as undetermined, but the story of Manuel and Miguel is more than just an unsolved case. It's a profound and unsettling cautionary tale. It's a story about the desperate human need to believe in something more, to find meaning beyond the mundane. These weren't uneducated fools. They were skilled technicians, husbands, fathers, but their search for transcendence led them down a rabbit hole of fringe beliefs, where the lines between science and mysticism, reality and delusion, blurred completely. They put their faith in a flawed idea and a questionable leader, and it cost them everything. Their story serves as a stark reminder of the incredible power of belief, a power that can inspire people to build cathedrals and create art, but also a power that, when unchecked by reason, can lead them to lie down on a lonely hill, put on lead masks, and wait for a signal that will never arrive. Today, the lead masks themselves sit in a police museum in Rio de Janeiro. They are simple, crudely made objects, cut from a sheet of plumbing lead. But they are imbued with the weight of this incredible story. They are silent, haunting artifacts from a moment when two men tried to touch the void, and the void, in its infinite indifference, simply swallowed them whole.